Hello again and welcome back. We're going to talk about CSS position property right now, okay? And I realize I left that out of a lot of the other discussion, and I think that's because CSS, Flexbox, and Grid kind of are the better tool. They provide more control and they do the things that you want to do. Position though is useful. So it is useful, but it's uh, only good in certain circumstances. So in the right circumstance, it's the perfect tool. The rest of the time, you should be using Flexbox and Grid. So exactly is CSS position? Well, it's a property like display or width or height, right? And it sets where something sits on the screen. It has a few rules around it, though, that you have to understand to get the most use out of it, okay? So let's take a look. I've created a simple HTML document here, okay? And I put the style sheet inside the document. So the styles will go here, styles are here, right? And then in the body of the document, I have a div, and I put a comment here to show where the div ends so we're really clear what's happening. So this is a container, and then it has two smaller divs inside it, or two child divs. So the container div has class name container, and then these two inner divs have class name box, and then they have class name A and B. So let's do a couple experiments. So in the styles down here, I'm going to add in container. You are going to have a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels, okay? And then we don't see anything here, so let's put a border on it. So let's say border of 1 pixel solid. Okay, so now I can see the border. And for fun, why don't we make that a little bit narrower, make this a little bit wider, and what we'll do is we'll also give it some margin. Okay, you'll see this will come into play later. So I'm going to say margin of 100 pixels on the top and 40 pixels on the sides. Okay, so now that pushes the box away from the left edge and down from the top. So now let's look at these two content boxes, right? So right now what we're looking at is the default behavior, like how does something display itself normally? So let's say if you're a box, actually let's do box A first, and let's give it a background color of tomato, right? So normally what happens is the height of an element is determined by the size of the content, and the width of the element expands to fill its container if it's a block. So divs are blocks, right? So this div is expanding on the width to fill the container, so it's 500 wide, and it collapses down around the content, so it's only as tall as the content, right? If I add some padding, if I say, padding, you are going to be 20 pixels, right? So now the padding pushes away and the box, pushes from the top and the bottom, around the content. So I padded the content, right? Okay. But essentially the height collapses and the width expands, okay? If we were to give the box a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Actually, you can see here if I give it a width of 100, it's just 100 wide. Still, the height is just what it would normally be, right? It collapses around the content. If I set the height to 100 pixels, then the height is 100 pixels, okay? And the content just sits up in the upper corner. Now, normally if you have two boxes or more than one child element, let's do another one here. Let's set background color of cornflower blue, right? So this box does the same thing, right? Expands to fill the space, collapses on the vertical, right? When you have two block elements that are children, they stack up, so one goes on top of the other, okay? So it doesn't matter how wide it is, right? It just kind of, it's not really flex column because that's a little different, but it's similar, right? It's everybody stacks up vertically, okay? So that's our default behaviors, okay? So first box is going to be on top. Let's say content. Let's call this box number 1. And let's say this guy's going to be box number 2 right here. There, so I got box, I said box 3, that's box 2. Okay, so box 1, box 2, okay? And that's how it works, right? So let's talk about position now for a minute, right? What happens if I make box number 1 position, and I set the position now? Actually, if I hit position here, you can see I have a couple choices. I have static, sticky, page. These are like special ones that have the browser prefix in front of it, so let's ignore those, right? And then we have inherit, initial, and unset. So I have absolute, relative, fixed, static, and sticky. Like these are pretty much the ones that you're going to use. Inherit means grab the property from its parent. Initial means like use the default, and unset means to change it. I'm actually not quite sure why you use this one. I've never used it, right? But the ones that we're going to use here are absolute, fixed, relative, static, and sticky, okay? So static is the default. So if I choose static here, nothing changes because that's what the default behavior is. Okay, so static means arrange everybody the way that we normally do, okay? Right, so I should stack up with other divs, I should, only be the height of my content, and my width is either set by the width or I expand to fill the space. So I'm going to remove the width and height for a moment and set the padding. So we'll say padding of 20 pixels, okay? Right? And, so this is what we had before, and we have position static. So remember, this is the child element. It's the red box here, okay? What happens if I change the position to absolute? Weird, okay? A couple things happened here, okay? One, the width of the element collapsed to the width of the content, right? And the other element, the blue box, I don't see the text anymore because it's underneath the red box, right? And I can prove that by setting the transparency here. So we can kind of see the blue boxes underneath. So the other thing that's happening here is when you set position absolute, all the other elements that would normally, recognize this absolute element and work their way around it, ignore it. So the blue box, all the other elements here are going to ignore the absolutely positioned thing, and they're going to position themselves as if it wasn't there, okay? The other thing is it collapses around the content, okay? So there's also some other features that are going to happen here, right? So one more is that there's a couple properties here called left, top. Actually, I'm going to do left, top. Sorry, it keeps code checking me there, code helping, right? So I'm going to do left, and then we'll do top, and then we'll do right, and then we'll do bottom. So these 4 properties allow you to set the position of an element. They only work if position is set to something other than static. So they work on relative, absolute, and I think they work on sticky too. Sticky, that's a new one. I'm not super familiar with that, but we'll catch up with that one later. I'm really going to focus on absolute and relative here. Okay. So position absolute kicks in these properties. These start working now. We haven't set these yet, so I'm going to take these out for a minute. But essentially, what they let you do is they let you set the distance of the left edge of your element to the left edge of its positioning context, okay? The top is the same way. Let's just set the top edge distance from the positioning context. Right sets the right edge from the positioning context, right? So let's take these out for a minute because usually you don't need all 4. I'm going to just set the left to 0, okay? And you'll notice when I set the left to 0, the red box moves all the way over to the left, to the flush against the left edge of the page. So this is really the left edge of the body tag, okay? Right, so it's the left edge of the body tag. What if I set the top here? So now it's at 0 pixels from the top edge. If I change this to, let's say, 5 pixels on the left, now we move over 5 pixels from the left edge of the page. So this is the distance. If I set 50, now I'm 50 pixels over from the left edge of the body, right? Let's set like 150 pixels, right? So you could use absolute position. Let's do 80 pixels from the top, right? So you could use absolute position to position an element anywhere on the page, right? And you'll notice if the page changes size, then this element is always 150 pixels from the left and 80 pixels down from the top. And we can switch that. If I change the left to the right edge and I change the top to the bottom, then now we're always going to be 150 pixels from the right edge, or the right edge of this element is 150 pixels from the right, and the bottom edge is 150 pixels from the bottom of its positioning context. So you can see if I change the size of the screen, this guy's always down in the lower corner, okay? So that works pretty good, but like it starts to ask some questions like, what is the positioning context, right? Well, the idea here is that, and this is like super important right here, so get this one down, right? You'll have to make an experimental page like I did. Make 2 divs that are the child of another div, okay? And then give one of your child divs some styles, including position absolute, and then use left, top, right, or bottom, right? Okay? So let's get back to the positioning context. So what is our positioning context? Well, the positioning context is an element that is like position relative, right? So we'll get to that in 1 second, right? But the idea is we look up the DOM tree. So I start here, I look at my parent and I ask, are you position relative? And the container here is not position relative. It doesn't say position relative, right? Okay, so it's not position relative. So it works its way up to the body tag, and the body tag isn't explicitly position relative to my understanding, but it's the top of the DOM tree. So the box here uses this as the positioning context, okay? So now remember, we're 150 pixels from the right, 150 here, and then 80 pixels from the bottom. So if I was to set the container here to position relative, watch what happens. When I save, the box now looks up the DOM tree, finds its relative parent, which is the container, right? It's this guy now because I've got position relative on container. And then it says, okay, well, I'm going to position myself so that my right edge is 150 pixels from the right edge of container and 80 pixels from the bottom. Okay? So that's the relation between relative and absolute. Right, so there's more to this story, so we're going to do it in the next video, but the first idea is that when you have elements, they behave like they normally do. They have, they expand to fill the width, they collapse on the height. If you set their position to absolute, they collapse on the width, and other elements that are normally positioned or static positioned ignore that absolute positioned element. And if another element, if you set the left, top, right, or bottom, then that element positions itself finding its positioning context. So it looks up the DOM tree to find a relative element. And when it finds a relative element, it uses that as the, to find the left, top, right, and bottom, right? And if you have a parent element that's position relative, then that parent element will be the positioning context. Otherwise, it's the body, okay? So I didn't explain that super good, but hopefully that is kind of clear, right? I could have said it better. But anyway, so that's kind of how it works, right? Um, you can use this, like, why would you use this? Well, let's imagine like I want to put this box in the lower corner. Now I could do that with flex. Okay, so that's why I'm saying like flex is actually the tool we're going to use most of the time, right? So I could put it in the lower corner. I could position these guys with space in between. I could, set, align items, to flex end, and that would push the bottom one all the way to the bottom, right? So there's ways around this, like you can simulate the same idea with flex, and usually that's probably the better idea. What this is good for is when you have an element that needs to ignore the other elements around it. So let's imagine that the blue box here, we gave it some padding, and I gave it like 50 pixels of padding, right? So now it's a really big blue box, but I want to put the red box in the upper corner here, okay? And I want it to overlap the blue box. Imagine this blue box was an image, and I want to put like a close button in the upper corner that overlaps it, right? So in that case, I could say you are going to be top of, let's make it like 5 pixels, right? And then I'm going to set the bottom, I'm going to actually set this to right and make the right, actually this is interesting too. Notice that when I set I had the bottom set to 80, right? The box stretches itself so that the bottom is 80 pixels away from the bottom edge of the container, right? So let's get back here. So let's move this to the upper corner. So I'm going to set the right to 5 pixels also, and now my box is 5 pixels from the top, 5 pixels from the right, and it overlaps the blue one, okay? So one more thing, right? Elements that are absolute are usually in front of non-absolute elements, so they move to the front. So this guy's going to overlap. Default behavior would be that the index that is higher is going to be in front. So the second box would come before or overlap. It would draw itself on top of the other box. Also, children draw themselves on top of parents. So the background color of container would appear below the box, either of these boxes' colors, okay? So anyway, so one way to use position absolute is to position something in front of or on top of something else, okay? Let's try one more thing just for fun. So let's imagine that the blue box was also position absolute. Oops, there we go, right? So this guy's absolute. So what happens if I move this over to where the other box was? Let's do it this way. Let's say, let's do it right of 60 pixels. Oops, wait, I got to put a colon in there. Hold on. Okay, so now you'll notice that the blue box is in front of the red box because it comes second here, and they're both absolute, okay? So there's one other property. There's actually a few more values we can use with absolute and a few more properties for position, right? Or actually, I guess those are the same, right? So the absolute can be relative, it can be static, can be sticky, right? Or fixed. There's one other property though that we can use, and it's called z-index. So z-index only applies when something's absolute position, okay? I think actually it applies when you're fixed also, but in our case right here, it doesn't apply if you're not absolute, okay? So let's try it. So let's imagine like I had this situation here, but I really wanted that red box to be in front, and I don't want to move it down below here, right? Because I could do that, and that would put it in front, okay? Right? But let's imagine like, I don't want to do that, but I want this red box to be in front of the blue one. So what we can do is we can use z-index, okay? So I'm going to do, oops, I got to do z-index, and you can just give this a value. It can be any value. Let's call it 9, right? So I'll say 9, and 9 is in front of the no value for the blue box, right? If I give the blue box a z-index of 8, it's behind the red box. If I give it a z-index of 10, it's going to be in front of the red box. So z-index can be any value, but it determines the front to back stacking order of absolutely positioned elements for us, right, in this example. Okay? So otherwise, like if you have absolute, or if you have z-index and it applies to, or if you have z-index applied to something and it's not absolute position, it doesn't do anything. Okay? So this only applies when you're in absolute position. I'm going to take that back too, because like I think it applies to fixed also, but for, like I said, for this discussion, it only applies to absolute, doesn't apply when you're not absolute. Okay? So anyway, so thanks for watching. I hope that that's interesting. I'm going to continue this in the next video because there's a few other properties that we want to look at and a few other things we want to do with this, okay? So again, thanks for watching. Like I said, try and make this example on your own and try these styles, because when you see this work and you type the properties in yourself, you'll kind of get a good picture of how it's working and what's going on.